Discussion of coalitionary warfare. And our first speaker will be Peter Turchyin, who is professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and adjunct professor of mathematics at the University of Connecticut in Storrs. He is broadly interested in he is a mathematical historian who uses ecology and evolutionary theory and mathematical analysis of long-term demographic cycles in humans to explain human history. And he's going to talk today about how and why human ultrasociality evolved, that is to say, why or how extensive cooperation among large numbers of unrelated individuals came into being, and the possible role of warfare in that historical change. Peter.
I'm going to use this microphone. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, enthusiastic crowds demonstrated in support of the war all over the European capitals and big cities. In one of these demonstrations, which took place in Munich on the next day after the declaration of war, was the young Adolf Hitler. He later wrote that this was the happiest day in his life. He volunteered and fought on the front. Not only he volunteered, during the first 2 months of war, 750,000 British young men volunteered for the war. In fact, United Kingdom did not have to introduce the draft until the 1916 because of such popular support for the war. Well, the butcher's bill was 8.5 million. A high proportion of those people who went happily to the war got killed, maimed, coughed their lungs, or were psychologically scarred. This raises a huge puzzle. Why are humans willing to sacrifice energy, time, treasure, even life itself, for the sake of huge societies encompassing people they've never met and they couldn't possibly meet? It is actually part of a larger, broader puzzle of human ultrasociality. It's our ability for extensive cooperations in very large groups of genetically unrelated individuals. Yes, France, wherever you're sitting, there is cooperation among unrelated individuals in apes and some other animals, but not in groups consisting of millions of people, millions of individuals. So it's a unique feature of humans, and it's a challenge to the evolutionary theory. It cannot be explained by our standard kit of theoretical models, kin selection or reciprocal altruism. Basically, I think in the last 10 years or so, it is becoming very clear that the explanation is really the theory of multilevel selection. And here are some names associated with the development of this theory. David Sloan Wilson, for those who can't read down there. Rob Boyd, Pete Richardson, and Sam Bowles, I think several of whom have been already mentioned in this symposium. So I claim that we have a rapidly maturing theory for the evolution of sociality in small-scale societies, by which I mean up to a few hundred people, all right? And the ultimate, as we evolutionary biologists like to separate causality into ultimate or evolutionary causes and proximate causality. The ultimate causality is the mechanism of multi-level selection, as I said, and it has been pithily summarized in a recent article by Ed Wilson and David Wilson, which, by the way, constitutes quite a change for Ed Wilson. He switched over to the group selectionist view quite dramatically, and it's a sign of things turning around. So they said selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. So it's a balance of selection. And depending on the concrete situation, either the individual level selection will trump the group level selection or vice versa. And the proximate factors, I'll just run through this list quickly, that enabled the evolution of sociality in humans are egalitarianism, labeling mechanisms such as monogamy and food sharing among the non-kin, and inequity aversion. And what they do, they reduce variation in intragroup variation in fitness. So they basically give the individual level selection less fuel to work on, and by that they shift the balance in favor of group level selection. Then we know recent work in behavioral economics on moralistic punishment. That's very important because these moralistic punishers not only are pro-social individuals, they contribute to the common good, but they also punish those who don't, and by that they stabilize cooperation by essentially suppressing the free riding. And of course, what I want to talk about, and I don't know if you in the back can see the lowest lines, but that's the selective force for driving the intergroup selection. And that's competition and conflict shading all the way to its lethal variety, which is warfare. So I will be not talking about aggression. In fact, I completely agree with Francis' thinking that individual aggression and group-level warfare, they are conceptually very different categories, especially as I will be interested in talking about warfare at a very large social scale. These are completely different categories. Any general will tell you that he doesn't want a browser, an aggressive individual who will be picking up fights with his teammates all the time. What they want a person who is disciplined and is willing to sacrifice for the sake of his unit and the army. They want a guy who would stand in the line and hold the pike, and when the cavalry is thundering towards you, and he will not run away. He will also not run forward, yelling at them, getting killed, right? So in armies, we don't want aggression. We want cooperation. That's really a weird idea for many people who haven't thought about it. Okay, it's a human universal warfare. Doesn't mean it's constant at a very high level. In fact, what I will be talking about, I will be capitalizing on variation in warfare, right? But it is a human universal because it is quite highly present, and I don't have to repeat this because, fortunately, the previous speakers have talked about it. Franz and Richard can find it out whether apes do it, but small-scale societies certainly don't do it, as indicated here in this cave painting of a fight of archers from Spain. And certainly, states do it. Okay, just quickly. Again, why war? Ultimate causation is essentially once the war has evolved, basically, pacifist groups were eliminated by warlike groups. It's the basic logic of natural selection, including its multi-level components. And proximate mechanisms have already been talked about. Competition for scarce resources, territory, females, human labor, movable wealth like livestock, portable wealth such as booty. And very important, strategic calculations. If you get attacked by somebody, you better use revenge to retaliation to either eliminate your enemy or to deter other potential enemies or that specific enemy. And the security dilemma. If in the anarchic world, you always expect attack, and it may be a good strategy to actually do a preemptive attack. Of course, that leads to chains of preemptive attack thinking. Okay, so evolutionary responses to warfare can take a number of routes. First of all, they can work to increase within group solidarity and cohesion. All right, and that has been noted by people ever since Darwin, and actually even before him. It can drive development of new technologies, not only military, but also administrative and ideological. What I want to focus is how the warfare, the selection imposed by warfare, drives the size of the cooperating group. As French like to say, God favors the big battalions. Ceteris paribus, everything else being equal, a larger group has a better chance of winning. Now, since I'm not terribly interested spending too much time on the evolution in small-scale societies, let me just say very briefly what was, I think, and what I think is the accepted theory, what is the limit, why the evolution in small-scale groups stopped at the level of 150 individuals, the magic number proposed by Robin Dunbar. Essentially, it relates to human capacity, the social channel capacity. In order to sustain cooperation within a group, where all the cooperation is based on face-to-face interactions, you have to know not only what people have done to you, right, but what they have done to each other, who cheated who. And you also need to know who is the moralistic punisher, who is not. So you have to keep in mind incredible amount of information, and you have to do a lot of social calculation in order to really survive in such groups. And as evolution drove the size of the group, eventually our brains simply hit that upper limit. We spend 30% of our energy feeding this hypertrophied organ. All right? So something some new method had to be found. Okay, so summary so far. I claim that we have a good beginning of a theory for the evolution of small-scale society. But the question is, how does large-scale societies evolve? How did evolution break through the limits imposed by face-to-face sociality? And what I want to do three things. First of all, I want to present a theory for the evolution of large-scale sociality, and I will introduce the concept of metaethnic frontiers for that. Second, I will present an empirical test for testing this theory. And the third thing, I will briefly touch on another empirical application of the theory, which will be a little closer to home. All right, so what are the things that we want to explain? Large-scale human societies have huge sizes. Here, I'm giving you some examples of historical empires. The Persian Empire controlled a territory of 6 million square kilometers, and population estimated as 35 millions. Roman Empire, 60 millions. Later, Qing China, 400 millions. Large societies. Secondly, these societies are stratified. They are inegalitarian. And that's very important because small-scale people are fiercely egalitarian. So why did people abandon that inequity aversion in order to live in in huge societies? They're complex, they have many hierarchical nested levels of organization, and they are also organized as states, division of labor, bureaucracies, and so on and so forth. All right, so here's a very simple-minded approach, and basically what I'm doing, I'm capitalizing on the observed two features. First of all, inequality, and second of all, hierarchical organization. And the idea is very simple, and it's not mine, really. Basically, if you take one simple elementary building block, which is, think about interpersonal relations. It's a lord and vassal, the superior and inferior, the boss and the worker. All right? So that's depicted here. This dot is superior, this is inferior. And if you do that, then you can start multiplying, first of all, at this level. Right? And now you've got one boss and three inferiors. Now, actually, I would prefer to think about it not as the agents here are not individuals, but rather local communities. Let's think about local communities. So the relationship really is between chiefly village and the subordinate village. So what we have here is a schematic of what an anthropologist calls the simple chiefdom. All right? One community is the chiefly villages where the chief resides, and there are the other smaller communities that are part of the chiefdom. And then we can just keep multiplying. We can add another layer. So now we have gone from simple chiefdom to a complex chiefdom. At the third level of organization above the local community, we go to an archaic state, mature state, empire. You can add up to 6 or 7 levels of hierarchy. That's what we observe in real life human societies. So basically, this method allows you to break through that limits of social channeling capacity, because not everybody does have to know everybody else. All individuals need to know where they are in the chain of command. And of course, that's just part of the story. Another big part of the story was the evolution of symbolic demarcation of the cooperative group. Once such hierarchical structures arose, people who didn't know each other, they needed to know when they encountered another individual, is it us or them? And they used dialect, language, religion, ornaments, and all kinds of things to delineate cooperating groups. That's the other very, very big part of the story. Okay, so I already said it. So basically, hierarchical social organization allows to increase group size without increasing social channel capacity, but there is a very serious downside. It inevitably leads to inegalitarian societies. As soon as you give power to somebody, thank you, these people in power will actually garner more resources for them. So basically, in order for that transition to be made, people had to compromise on their inequity aversion. All right? So there had to be a very compelling reason why they would do that. And the hypothesis that I propose is that if warfare is variable, and it is, as I'll show in a minute, then evolution of social complexity should be favored where the warfare is particularly intense. So now we get to these metaethnic frontiers. What do I mean by that? A metaethnic community is the largest scale grouping of people. It's supranational, or metaethnic, which means beyond ethnic. It's above the groups that we think usually as ethnic. So examples include Latin Christendom, which incorporated several Western European nations, Dar al-Islam, and also not those that we think of as civilizations in Toynbee's sense, but also such people as Turkic and Mongolian nomadic pastoralists. All right? Now, metaethnic frontiers is where two such communities actually come in contact and conflict. All right? And Richard has already talked about an observable tendency that for the intensity of warfare to increase as a social distance, as a cultural distance between groups increases. That's why external warfare is more intense than internal warfare. Now here I'm looking at the very largest social level of group. Basically, large cultural distance makes it easier to dehumanize the adversary. All right? And that way promotes the intensity of warfare all the way up to genocide. Just to illustrate this with a current day example, this is a picture of the infamous Janjaweed, the nomadic militia that has been perpetrating genocide in Darfur. Now, here's the story, which actually will fit with what other people have been talking before. How did it happen? It's not really, the newspapers tend to blame the government in Sudan, but the government should be blamed not for actively pursuing genocide, but by failing to impose peace and order in that region. All right? So from the early 1980s, there was a severe drought in this region. The plains were used by the nomads, and they were worst hit. Many of them lost their herds. And so they migrated towards the hill region, which had greater rainfall, and it was inhabited by farmers. And many of those nomads who lost their herds started raiding their farmers for sustenance, essentially. Conflict developed between farmers and nomads. Nomads created an alliance, which is called Janjaweed, in order to be more successful at robbing farmers. And farmers created, in defense, their own alliance, which eventually allied with the Sudan Popular Liberation Army, and that's how the government began supporting Janjaweed. So here's the picture of one of the farmers' alliances. This guy who is part of the militia, farmers' militia, is visiting a village that has been burned and looted by the nomads. So here we have a situation, a frontier, a cultural frontier between nomads and farmers, And it's extremely easy. History shows over and over again that it's extremely easy to get high-intensity warfare all the way up to genocide in such places. There are thousands of examples of a Genghis Khan or Tamerlane riding with his army into a region, killing everybody, piling their heads in the pile, and then riding away. So that's really quite a typical feature of the dynamics of the interaction. Now, step frontier is not the only thing. There are other civilization frontiers, such as civilization of fault lines, for example, the frontier between Muslims and Christians in Iberia during the Reconquista. There is civilization barbarism frontier, for example, Mediterranean civilization and barbarian quotes, Celts. But I will focus, because time is short, I will focus just on the step frontier. All right, so now we have a prediction. We get to the second part, which is trying to test empirically this idea. So the prediction is that the largest states, the largest social scale, should evolve in those areas where settled and nomadic societies actually interact. And the database I constructed based on several work of others, previous authors. It basically includes all the largest territorial polities known to me at this point. I use the cutoff point of 1 megameter squared. All right, and there's about 65 such polities. Only one of them, Inca, is outside of Afro-Eurasia, and so I'll show you only the situation in Afro-Eurasia. Now, this color, this is the steppe, and this is the hot desert, and this is the cold desert, basically. And there's an associated belt of steppes running right around them. And I have indicated the locations. I have indicated the locations of different of these mega empires, of these huge empires. And you can see that with some exceptions, such as Roman Empire, Frankish Empire here, they are clustering heavily in this belt. All right? And let's look at some of these hotspots, like East Asian spot of imperial genesis. There has been 14 unifications of China from the Shang era to Communist era. All right? Now, 8 of them were from the northwest, 3 from the northeast, 2 from the north central, only 1 from the south. And of course, that's where the steppe frontier impacts China in the north, from the northwest. South Asia. The steppe enters South Asia through the northwest also. And we see the same thing. 5 starting in the northwest, 3 in the north, 1 in the west, nothing in the northeast, nothing in Central Asia, nothing in Southern Asia. There were small, medium-sized states there, but none of the huge million square kilometer type states arose there. Egypt, we think of Egypt surrounded by desert, and it is, of course. But 5,000 years ago, southern Egypt was surrounded by steppes, and there was a substantial nomadic population there. All 4 native unifications of Egypt proceeded from south to north. I think I'll skip this because I'm running out of time. So there is, I have shown you sort of a bird's eye view of the pattern, but you can do statistics and it comes out highly significant. And those exceptions, by the way, that didn't arise on the steppe frontiers, they arose on a different kind of metaethnic frontiers. So it's really one of the strongest macrohistorical generalizations that I know. All right, now, just to give you an example of not a steppe frontier, let's go to North America. And by the way, it's in more detail. It's in more detail developed in my book on War and Peace and War. So I'll go very quickly through this. First of all, the United States is known to be a highly cooperative society. And we know this both from the observations by such astute people like Alexis de Tocqueville and also from modern social science works by such people as Robert Putnam, an abundance of social capital. Also, it's justly famous as the melting pot, a pluribus unum. All right, so these are very interesting features of the American society. And by the way, since I published my book, 2 more books came out, and I'll be using actually this one in a minute to supplement the basic idea. All right. But we should think about early 17th century when the first European settlers arrived in what is now United States. What happened was that a civilization barbarism frontier developed. And it operated for almost 300 centuries until the end of Indian wars at the end of the 19th century. It was extremely intense, often genocidal. There were a lot of horrific torture, mutual atrocities. One book actually counted 16,000 such atrocities across the 300 years. And here's an idea, the casualties in some American wars. In the early Indian wars, this is wars, 17th century, right? The casualties, here's 30% of the population was wiped out. In the King Philip's War in Massachusetts, 3% of the population was wiped out. Nothing like that happened in the modern world wars. So how do these two observations, the ability of Americans to form voluntary associations and this genocidal frontier, how are they related? And here I use Silver's book on Our Savage Neighbors. He talks about a situation in Pennsylvania starting around 1740s. You think of them as the white people, but they were not white people. They didn't think of themselves that way. They were split in a variety of ethnic and religious denominations. So German Lutherans were fighting with the Moravians, and in fact Quakers were fighting among themselves. They were really splintered society. They arrived from Europe, and they really thought of each other as enemies. And then there was a series of Indian wars, all right? Yeah, somebody just wrote in 1740s, Pennsylvania is a complete bubble. And there was a series of Indian wars. And back in the 1740s, the first ethnically and denominationally based clubs appeared, and they were helping primarily the narrow group. But then, when the war with Indians developed, actually the series of them, there were lots of refugees, and so such societies, such as St. Andrews, which was originally Scottish, or Deutsche Gesellschaft, which was German, they started helping more broadly, and eventually they expanded the definition of us to include white people. When first Europeans and Indians came in contact, they didn't think of themselves as white and red people. It developed as the process of this interaction and as the conflict escalated. So here we see a direct effect of how having that other is, I'm done. Let me just summarize things. So here we see, in this example, North American example, we see a specific example of how being presented by very alien and very frightening other, right, forces people who don't think of themselves as us at first to actually unite and become a unified group, all right? And this is actually the basic mechanism that works over and over in history. Okay, so just to finish up, I have hoped that I have achieved three things here, actually. I'll skip my slide on the European Union, but you can ask me about that later. First of all, warfare is ubiquitous, but it is not constant, and that allows us to capitalize on it as an explanatory variable. Secondly, it's particularly intense in those areas where culturally very different, where social distance is very big between two groups who are in contact and conflict. And I call such places metaethnic frontiers, and especially steppe frontiers. And empirical evidence shows that there is a very strong association between the metaethnic frontiers and the rise of the largest empires. Thank you.
Yes. I'd like to make a comment. Peter, every time you say human beings or people, you could have substituted the word men, males. Richard showed us this morning that coalition aggression never benefited females. The chimps simply had to climb different trees. And nobody seems to sort of emphasize that in this. It seems to me women are intrinsically more empathetic. And if we want to look for things for peace, we should look for anything which makes women more autonomous. And in the whole of human history, I cannot find a single example where a group of women with what Richard calls internally driven behavior have banded together to systematically go out and kill other human beings, and found that rather exciting. And it's astonishing that we don't have that.
Well, I don't know if the Scythian Amazons found it exciting. We don't know. We can't ask them. But it's very well documented historically that Yes, okay, all right. Well, and well taken, but remember, I don't even run out of my 25 minutes. So what do you want me? Of course, women are important, and in my book I actually talk about it, because these societies may have started as armies. Think about Germans, on the Roman frontier. But those of these warriors who didn't treat their women right, and those who didn't have the proactive women playing the important social role, they are the ones who actually disappeared in the process of this intergroup competition. They lost it out to others. All right, but this is a big topic, and I don't want to diminish the role of women. But when we talk about warfare, there obviously I think we are justified of saying he, right? That pronoun which is being to be banned from. But humanity includes women, according to my definition.
Right. But you're talking about men.
Okay, I'm sorry if I give that impression. Any other questions? Yeah.
I didn't understand what it was about steps that make this kind of conflict more common.
Right, thanks. Basically, what I am claiming is that the frontier between steppe nomadic pastoralists and settled agriculturalists is one of the largest social distances you could achieve. If you think about, many nomadic people don't even have a special word for farmer. They use the same as livestock. There's, for example, in Turkic language, not Turkish, but Turkic language, that term was used for farmers. And vice versa. To farmers, those raiders from the steppe are completely horrifying. They come and they kill, loot, they abduct people, they do all horrible things, then disappear. You cannot do anything about them. In my book, I actually describe the situation on the Russian and Tatar frontier. It was just absolutely horrific, and there are many other situations of this kind. So the steppe frontiers is not the only type of this metaethnic frontier, but they tend to be the most intense. And I don't dismiss, of course, that there is also trade and some cooperation and all kinds of things. It's a statistical argument. Statistically, we find much greater intensity of warfare and frequency of genocide in such places.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dominic Johnson, who has a doctorate in evolutionary biology from Oxford University and a doctorate from the University of Geneva in political science. And when I did some homework to prepare some background remarks on Dominic Johnson, I Googled his name, and I got a link to Princeton University. And the web page there said that he was located at Harvard. And on the program it says he's at Edinburgh. So he's been around, both in terms of his degrees and geographically and intellectually where he is located. Dominic is interested broadly in using new research on human nature to understand international relations, conflict resolution, and everyday life. He's also interested in explaining the origins of human religions and moral systems in terms of intergroup conflict and intragroup cooperation and the ways in which those two go hand in hand. Dominic.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm now in a Department of Politics and International Relations. I like to see myself as an infiltrator. Rather than pushing evolution and biology onto them from the outside, I snuck in and doing it from the inside, which is interesting. Here's my first slide, because this is where I definitely am now, and I will be for a little while. This is Edinburgh in the UK. Every day I walk to work from my home, and I walk past this, which is Edinburgh Castle, which was built to keep out Richard Wrangham's ancestors. And it's a constant reminder that war is an ever-present feature of our culture. Even if it's infrequent, we have the marks of how important it was in the past. And of course, England and Scotland have been at war for centuries. We're in a stage of ceasefire for the last 300 years, but who knows how long it will last. Okay, here's the outline of my talk. How do you study war? It's very difficult. One thing you can do is go into the lab and test how people behave under scenarios similar to war. I want to talk first very briefly about evolution and political science, the discipline, and then 4 things that I've looked at in the lab: overconfidence, testosterone, genetics, and partisanship, and then to conclude with some thoughts on how this might influence modern war. So a few points on evolution and political science. These are 2 books written by political scientists who have seen the light, as I like to think, and are bringing in the psychological and evolutionary psychological literature to understand international relations better. The one on the left is about international relations theory, so he's really going at the heart of what international relations theorists worry about. Human nature, what it is, why states are in a constant state of war. And the one on the right is much more about neurobiology and psychology, but it's a good sign. However, the problem with for political scientists is that they tend to see evolutionary psychology, first of all, as evil. They haven't yet read Steve Pinker's Blank Slate, and they must. But even if they accept it, they tend to think that it's about explaining individual behavior. They call this the sort of big man theory of history, that if individuals are important in determining what happens, then maybe psychology and then maybe evolutionary psychology might help. But they're much more concerned usually about 2 other levels of analysis. The state, which is the amalgamation of many people and bureaucracies and institutions which have to have explanations of their own for how they function. And then at the top level, the system, the world system. And that's how countries interact under anarchy. And this is seen as perhaps the most important thing underlying international relations theory. There is no Leviathan out there to control individual states' actions. It's a self-help system, and that drives a lot of the dynamics of interstate war. Now, however, although they would say that evolutionary psychology, if anything, can only affect the bottom level, I just want to very briefly mention a very interesting project I'm involved in called the Natural Security Project, which actually says no. Evolution has lessons for all of those levels of analysis. This is run by a marine biologist called Rafe Sagarin and a policy person called Terry Taylor. And the point is that 3.5 billion years of life on Earth has lessons for all sorts of aspects of human security, which don't only derive from evolutionary psychology, but also behavioral ecology, paleontology, epidemiology, immunology. So, for example, how does the body defend against unpredictable threats and ramp up when the threat arises? It may have lessons for the Department of Homeland Security, for example. I can't talk more about that today, but I just wanted to expand our thinking beyond just evolutionary psychology at this conference and think more broadly about how Darwin and evolution might influence how we study, analyze, understand, and predict war and human security. Okay, so the first thing that we've looked at in the lab is something which I was inspired to by Richard Wrangham. He wrote a very influential paper in Evolution and Human Behavior, which suggested that perhaps overconfidence is adaptive. The title was, "Is Military Incompetence Adaptive?" Meaning, is it perhaps the case that overconfidence in our ability to fight other groups has actually helped us in the past by increasing the efficacy of bluffing, increasing morale and resolve, and so on. And funnily enough, if you look at the political science literature, other people these are political scientists, had come to the conclusion after studying The Causes of War, Geoffrey Blaney's book in 1973, there was something he couldn't quite put his finger on. But it was striking to him how on the eve of war, what you often find is overconfidence. 25 years later, another book on The Causes of War, again another political scientist, reviewed the entire literature and again concluded that there is something about overconfidence which is ever present at the beginning of what he says most, if not all, wars, and seems to be something very important about human nature. So this is my book. You may remember this guy, your former president, on the USS Lincoln, having just landed to declare mission accomplished in Iraq. This was taking the psychology literature and saying, yes, if you look at the social psychology literature, you find that overconfidence is no surprise. It's what you find in all sorts of social psychology experiments. humans, particularly men, seem to have an overconfident bias in three particular areas: our self-assessments, our illusion of control, and our invulnerability to risk. So, for example, 80% of people think they're above average drivers, 95% of college professors think they do above average work. When I gave that talk this talk in Stanford once, someone shouted out the back, "It's true here." So anyway, I think the answer is that for a psychologist, this is maybe no surprise. Overconfidence is widespread and pervasive and would therefore perhaps almost automatically be at least a potential cause of war. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate in psychology with Amos Tversky in economics, says that in all of his work on the cognitive revolution, the bottom line is that all the biases in judgment that have been identified in the last 15 years tend to bias decision-making towards the hawkish side. And to a Darwinian, that suggests perhaps some sort of adaptive function. However, although there does seem to be an association, no one had sort of taken this into the lab and asked, do people display the same biases towards overconfidence in the relevant context of conflict? As I said, most of the studies were things like average driving ability and so on. And beyond that, overconfidence, according to Richard Wrangham's idea, should be more pronounced among males. It's males who were the warriors and therefore would have benefited from its adaptive functions. And then the sort of crucial causal question, does overconfidence, if it exists, increase the probability of aggression? This was a study with several collaborators at Harvard. Here are three of the main ones. Steve Rosen on the left, Rose McDermott in the middle, and a familiar face, Richard Wrangham, on the right. These are Harvard students at war, occupying the president's office. Can't remember why now. The experiment was set up very briefly, 200 subjects in anonymous pairs in a laboratory where they were engaged in a hypothetical conflict over resources. They interacted via computers. They had a budget every round to allocate to either their industry or to their military forces, and they could decide to do whatever they wanted. They could attack their opponent, they could negotiate, pass messages, and so on. But the most striking thing we found is if you ask people to rank how well they expect to do, okay, so the lower numbers mean you expect to do better. Males systematically overestimate how well they'll do. They expect to be a higher rank at the end of the game. And there's a significant sex difference. So on average, all else equal, they should expect to come out somewhere in the middle of 200 people, about 100. Men significantly overestimate, women are about right. And after they've played the game, without finding out the results, the men have discovered it is a little bit more tricky than they thought. They've revised their estimates up a little bit. So overconfidence is there in the context of conflict. And crucially, that causal question, you find that unprovoked attacks, so these are people who decided to go ahead and attack their enemy without having had any provocation at all, had significantly higher self-ranking scores. So all data on the left, for example, the Hawks, which are the ones who carried out these unprovoked attacks, had significantly higher pre-game self-ranking scores. And this was not quite significant, but strong in men and not in women. The other thing we found was that the narcissistic personality inventory predicted both aggression and confidence. We looked at a bunch of personality measures, and this was the one which sort of came out most strongly, but again, only for males. So to summarize that part of the talk, people do display these same biases towards overconfidence in the context of conflict. It is more pronounced among males. It does increase the probability of aggression, and there do seem to be psychological factors which underlie those phenomena. Now, another thing that Richard proposed in his original paper was that what is the source of this confidence? Where does it come from? And we don't know, but one idea that Richard proposed was it's from testosterone. We have a surge of testosterone, boosts your confidence, increases the probability of challenging an opponent and perhaps aggression. And I'm sure all of you know that the studies on testosterone and aggression are somewhat controversial. We're going to hear a lot more about them tomorrow, but I just wanted to tell you what we found. The hypothesis were that high testosterone subjects should be more aggressive and that they should be more confident. This is all the data pooled from the same experiment. You do find that those who carried out unprovoked attacks had significantly higher testosterone levels. However, if you split it by sex, it goes away. So we can't tell anything here within the sexes. We don't know if men with high... Well, we do know that men with higher testosterone levels were not more likely to attack their opponents. What we did find, very interestingly, is this alternative measure of testosterone exposure when you're a fetus. I was very skeptical of all this when I first heard about it, but the ratio of your second and fourth digit is correlated with testosterone exposure in utero. So it's been seen as this biomarker of testosterone at that stage of life, and a shorter index finger implies high testosterone exposure. This was a separate paper led by Matt McIntyre, and we found very strong results on the right hand, which is typically the hand on which you find these effects. And this was not a phenomenon that disappeared when you split it by sex. If you look at all of the data and within males only, you find that more male typical high testosterone exposure males were more likely to make unprovoked attacks. It wasn't true for women. So mixed results, because salivary testosterone didn't conform to our hypotheses, but this alternative measure of 2D4D did. Okay. Now, the most recent thing we've done is to try and get a bit more biological. When I give this presentation, people often get a little worried about wishy-washy psychological measures, and really we're making biological arguments. Testosterone was one way to go, and genetics is another. Monoamine oxidase is an enzyme which is found in neurons in the brain. It's vital to inactivation of synaptic neurotransmitters, including serotonin and adrenaline and dopamine. And a dysfunction of this enzyme causes neurological disorders. And many of these are associated with aggression. Now, there's a gene encoding for this enzyme on the X chromosome, and previous circumstantial evidence had tied it to aggression. So there was a famous case of a Dutch family which had a mutation which meant that many of the males in subsequent generations did not have MAOA at all, and they had a chronic history of aggressive violence. Now, what's interesting about this gene is that it has a naturally occurring polymorphism among all of us. So there are two forms, but there are several forms with two effects. The low-activity form is found in 33% of the Western population, and the high-activity form is what everyone else has. And several studies, including the famous one by Caspi in Science in 2002, found that the low-activity MAOA subjects, if they also experienced childhood trauma, were more likely to show signs of increased aggression in later life. And there seems to be some good reasons why this might be the case. There's both structural and functional reasons. This is from a review paper showing that low-activity MAOA subjects actually have a reduction in the volume of certain brain areas, including the amygdala and a couple of other areas you see there. So there do seem to be sort of mechanistic reasons why low-activity MAOA subjects might have different behavioral responses. So we had two very simple hypotheses. All of the subjects to date had looked at self-report aggression. So they genotype their subjects and then they ask them, how violent are you? How often do you get angry and hit someone? That kind of thing. That's all very well, but as you know, self-report questionnaires potentially misleading. So we wanted to test whether there was evidence of behavioral aggression, which varies with this genotype. And especially when people are particularly provoked. The literature suggests that you wouldn't see a difference unless they're in a particularly sort of provocative situation. Right, it's difficult to study aggression in the lab because of ethics. So we came up with this hot sauce paradigm, which has been used before in the psychology literature. 2 stages. Subjects earn money in a very simple vocabulary task, and they earn money. So they earn this money through their own effort. And then an anonymous partner linked over a computer is able to take earnings away from them. Okay, so they're stealing the money they've just earned. And in fact, we deceived them so we could standardize the responses. They could either take a small amount or a large amount, low or high take. Now, the original subject then had the opportunity to punish the person who had taken money from them. Okay, so this was our measure of aggression. Punish them by allocating them hot sauce, nasty, horrible to eat hot sauce which they'd tried themselves at the beginning of the experiment. And the second person couldn't keep the money unless they ate the hot sauce. So basic results, this is just to test whether our provocation treatment was working. So this is all data. You see that people who had more money taken on the right, the high-take condition, were much more likely to allocate the hot sauce to their opponent. And then here's the really interesting thing. When you split that by MAOA genotype, you find that in the low provocation condition, there's no actual difference between MAOA genotype. But in the high provocation condition, people with the low activity form of MAOA are significantly more likely to punish their opponent. So here's evidence of behavioral aggression related to this genotype. We did 4 rounds, and there were concerns about interference across rounds. So we also looked at the first time a particular amount was taken to try and avoid confounds of earlier experience, but you find it essentially the same thing, a significant effect at high take, and also an effect in the low take condition, but not significant. Across all rounds, the blue are the low activity subjects. They punish more in every single round, and especially in round 1. I'm going to zoom through this. This is just other ways of analysing the data. If you compare only those who punished the maximum amount, perhaps the ones who punished 1 or 2, it didn't really mean anything. If you look at only maximum amounts, you get the same result. And if you do a multivariate model where you include all of the variables in the analysis at the same time and look at the interaction of genotype and the amount of money taken, you again find a significant interaction between genotype and the amount of provocation. So, to summarize, low-activity MAO subjects do display higher levels of behavioral aggression, especially in a high provocation condition. Of course, this has implications. This literature already had implications for medicine and potentially for law. We argue it also has implications for recruitment and the military. Very interesting question as to the evolutionary origins of this polymorphism. 33% of the Western population have the low-activity MAOA form. Why is it preserved? Perhaps it's a neutral effect in real life, perhaps it has some secondary function, but the idea is there that it may have some sort of adaptive advantage. There are many examples in the biological literature of frequency-dependent selection where you have some proportion of the population who have a particular behavioral type, and it's only effective when a subset of the population has it. If everyone has it, it's no use anymore. Raises some interesting questions. There's a huge controversy over this gene because it varies between cultures. Happy to talk to you about that later, but I don't want to get into it now. Now, final thing, for my lab tests, political scientists don't usually know what to make of these kinds of results, but one thing they always say is you've got to look at political ideology. That's the variable which to them explains so much. I mean, turn on the news and it's all about the Democrats versus the Republicans, and that's true in many domains of policy choices and policy preferences, both domestic and foreign. So we really need to start looking at partisanship and ideological preferences. There's a huge literature in the psychology literature on what you might call the psychology of conservatism, if you like, the spectrum from conservatism to liberalism. A recent review paper did a meta-analysis of many hundreds of studies, and the basic conclusion was that conservatism strongly and consistently is predicted by a range of psychological factors which stem from 3 things: fear, threat, and uncertainty. Those 3 elements predict conservatism. And there's been a flurry of papers in the science literature recently on how conservatives and liberals react differently in the lab to threat stimuli. This was a study in Science which looked at eye blinks and skin conductance. Conservatives showed much larger physiological reactions. This was a brain study where conservatives showed lower activity in an area of the brain important for cognitive control and self-regulation. And then a study not yet published showed Republicans had greater amygdala activation in a risk-taking task. So there's a sort of gathering evidence that what the psychologists have found may have a sort of biological substance. So for us, this means there's a couple of important hypotheses to test. That conservatism, if it's to do with threat, reactions to threat, it might predict military aggression in response to a threat. Thank you. So we got people into a lab and we got them to play hypothetical international crisis scenarios, very simple paper and pencil type thing, a hostage crisis and a crisis in the Afghanistan campaign and a coup in Latin America. I won't go into the details now, I just want to show you the results. But the key point is that the subjects had three possible responses. They could concede. These were sort of disguised. It wouldn't be like surrendering, but it would be a way of sort of stepping back and avoiding conflict. They could concede, they could negotiate, or they could carry out some sort of military attack. If you look at their declared party, you find that Republicans were significantly more likely to choose the aggressive option over Democrats. I'm going to skip the breakdown by scenario. And then this is the liberal conservative scale, 1 to 7 scale, which is widely used in the literature. And you find almost a monotonic increase. As people become more conservative towards the right, they become much more likely to, significantly more likely, to display aggression in these political scenarios we put them in. That might not matter if it doesn't translate to what they believe about the real world. And this was associating their aggression in the game to their beliefs about what the surge might do in Iraq. So on the right are people who believed that the surge will improve security in Iraq, and they had significantly higher aggression scores in the game, in the scenarios. Again, if you ask them about bombing Iran, this has nothing to do with the nuclear issue. This is just if Iran is found to be helping the insurgents in Iraq, would you favor bombing? A significantly higher preference for bombing among those who were more aggressive in the scenarios. And very interesting for me, we threw in confidence at the last minute because I have to say, of all the things we've done with these war games, there are two critical things: sex and confidence. Always seems to come out as important. And we found that confidence was a significant predictor of political aggression in these games too. And it is also associated with ideology and partisanship. Conservatives tended to be more confident that their chosen course of action would succeed. This was just showing that if you put it all the variables into a multivariate analysis, both ideology and confidence both independently explain variance in the outcome. Thank you. So conservative predicts military aggression in response to a threat, and that aggression doesn't seem to be meaningless. It actually corresponds to their foreign policy preferences as well. Okay, conclusions. What are we to make of all this in terms of understanding evolution and war? Well, I think there's a very simple point, which is that when we observe costly behavior in the real world, it doesn't mean it's necessarily maladaptive. It may be just out of context. This is a reed warbler feeding a cuckoo. Evolution has designed it to feed whatever's in its nest. Just because here it happens to be feeding a cuckoo doesn't mean that kind of feeding behavior is maladaptive. We might be facing the same sort of situation with war. If you look at fitness benefits in our evolutionary past and our present, Franz and Richard have been arguing a little bit over whether aggression was adaptive or maladaptive in our past. So this aspect, we haven't talked at all about whether aggression is adaptive or maladaptive in the present. And in order to do that, you need information on outcomes. Pretty much everyone who studies aggression looks at causes of aggression. But in order to understand its potential adaptive significance, we really need data on its outcomes. Does it bring material gains to those who perpetrate it? I think it's quite clear that humans do show adaptations for aggression, and that's independent of the debate over where in our evolutionary history the violence arose. We nevertheless show these adaptations now. The question is, do they play a role in contemporary war? And I just want to show you one example which comes out of Richard Wrangham's imbalance of power hypothesis. It makes a very explicit prediction. Aggression can be adaptive if there are very low costs to the attacker, and that means that you have a superiority and a surprise element, which means you actually have very low costs to yourself of engaging in some aggressive action. Two very simple predictions. That means aggression may still be adaptive in small conflict events. You remember Richard said that although wars may be different, within wars you may have these imbalances of power which can remain adaptive. But that would not hold in wars as a whole. Aggression would not necessarily be adaptive in wars. If you look at the data, these are conflict events within wars from a data set called the HERO data set that Richard and I and Steve Rosen looked at a few years ago. And what you see here is that as the attacking side's power superiority increases along the x-axis, the probability that it wins also increases. Okay, so both of those regression lines are significant for raids in black, which are surprise attacks, and battles, which are the sort of stage battles where both sides know it's going to happen. But the really interesting thing about this is that the slope for the raid regression line is significantly steeper than that for battles, meaning that raids are still a better way of ensuring victory, as long as you have a significantly strong enough superiority. Thank you. The last slide shows that this is exactly the opposite case in wars as a whole, so interstate wars. These four categories are 50-year periods since 1800. And what you find is that in the past, the strong actors in grey typically won nearly all of the conflicts they fought. But over time, we've seen this decline to such an extent that now, in the last 50 years, it's the weak actors who tend to win. And I would argue that this is perhaps some circumstantial evidence that our adaptive mechanisms for conflict may still be working in the conflict events within wars, but they're leading us into wars which we may not win, even if we have superior power. And that's my final slide. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. They're states which have a military power 10 times less than the strong actors. That was how it was operationalized in that paper. So it wasn't messed up by states which happened to be, slightly more or less powerful than each other. They were really very different ends of the spectrum. Yeah.
Not all genes on the X are subject to activation.
Right.
So the female AOA is exactly what both X's and the cells.
It gets complicated. In that study, I should have mentioned, we didn't look at females at all for two reasons. One, we've had a very hard time publishing anything in political science journals which shows a sex difference. It's a huge problem. The second reason is exactly what you say, that with females you can get both activated and then very complex outcomes in terms of their MAOA production. So we deliberately excluded them to keep it simple. Yeah.
Do you know which of those variants is based on and how
No, but I should have mentioned that there's a paper in PNAS which identifies positive selection pressure on MAOA to keep it in the population. The controversy I mentioned was related to the Maori population, which have about 2/3 of the population with the low activity form. And people have argued that it lent some sort of advantage in their exploration of the Pacific and the wars that they had to fight to survive.
Or New Zealand?
New Zealand. Yeah.
I would like to ask a little question myself. You asked about why there is this overconfidence, and then went on to give what I would call proximate explanations for it. What about the long-term historical question of why there is such overconfidence? Was it functionally useful in the past and is maladaptive now, or what?
So I think the answer is that potentially it is a great way of creating credible bluffs. It's a great way of boosting morale and resolve. The problem is that I haven't found a way to test that. So it remains a hypothesis. But it's quite interesting that everywhere you look, from boxing to other sports to poker, some sort of element of overconfidence is sort of recognized. Napoleon argued that morale is 3 times more important than physical force, and Clausewitz also is sort of seen, especially by my political science colleagues, as the guru on all of this kind of thing. Also mentions, he calls it boldness, and argues that it has a sort of extra useful function, which is hard to describe, but is there, and when it's there, it's incredibly powerful.
Is overconfidence a subset of kind of a bias towards a sense of controllability?
I'd definitely say it's an element of it.
Yeah, a subset.
I would say the illusion of control is one example of overconfidence. I think.
I just have one more question.
Do people become more conservative as they get older?
That's a good question. I wish I knew the answer. Does anyone know of a study looking at that? The political scientists study this kind of thing, and the one thing they found is that it is passed on in families. So the best predictor of political ideology is what your parents were. There's a big debate about that now because there's a study showing that there's a genetic component to it as well as heritable, as well as influenced by socialization.
Thank you, Dominic. I think we should move on to the next series. It has been concluded from the diversity of levels of explanation we've been talking about and different takes on the evolution of human aggression this afternoon, that it'd be better to have a panel discussion instead of putting the entire responsibility of discussing these ideas on one or two people. And so what we'd like to do is get all of the presenters up here to have a panel discussion, and to that end, would they then come forward, and we'll put a few more chairs up here, and we'll take about 10 minutes on that. I think we'll have some concluding remarks from Steve Downs if he feels up to it. Okay? So, So let's bring a few chairs up here and have a panel discussion. Sarah.
I think it would be very helpful to me, and any one of these people on the panel, I think would be very helpful to have answer it. They're all qualified answers. It would be very helpful to have more attention paid to the definitions people are using, because there's been a lot of conflation all through the session. For example, Malcolm Pops raised it, so humanity, are we talking about males or females, or humanity includes both? We're talking about human nature, and we're talking about societies have always been warlike, but we're kind of conflating den-level hunter-gatherers with complex hunter-gatherers with early modern Europe. What are we talking about when we have more attention to specifically what we mean when we say humans are warlike?
Let me give you an example about the role of females. My example of the British man volunteering, all right? I didn't have time to go to the details.
I remember that from your book.
Right, okay. But maybe other things for the volunteer. This is all about white flesh. Basically, young males are the age in 1914, 1915 who are not in the uniform. They would be pestered by women in the streets in London and everywhere in England. They would come to them and pin white feathers on their lapels. And that was a sign of cowardice, and so basically this was a very, very strong sanctioning against males who are perceived to be free riders in this effort. And that's a very typical type of situation in many other societies.
Richard Wrangham has suggested that we devote subsequent discussion to reflecting upon how what we now have heard about and learned about the evolution of human aggression, how that bears on question of suppressing it, having more favorable future directions, and less war.
So I don't have any answers, but hey, the point of being here was partly just to assess where we are with our understanding of the evolution of war, but also we've been given, as speakers, explicit instructions to try and include in our presentations some kinds of thoughts about where we're going in an optimistic sense. And we have only had sort of scattered observations on that, and maybe that's because we're still in the early stages of the discussion, and by tomorrow something will spontaneously arise about now we can send a letter to the president saying we've solved the problem. I don't mean to sort of be too jocular about it, because I mean, actually, of course, since people have been writing about war, I think people have been trying to think about how to ameliorate it. We've been hearing quite opposing views today, in some ways, about where we're going. Patricia Lambert was giving us a scenario that I think we have to take very seriously, which is that there is evidence from the past that when resources become a problem for a population, then that leads to an increased probability of warfare. And we all understand about the difficulties of the next century and more. Steve Pinker is saying that, look at this wonderful trend we've got, and all we need to do is just extrapolate these points on the graph, and life takes care of itself. Malcolm Potts is saying, listen. What's that? Okay, there you go. So I'm only just spinning out this little introduction to give people a chance to think, because I was just going to suggest that that anybody might want to get the discussion going about how we can think most optimistically, and then use that as a platform for moving forwards tomorrow. Martin.
It's a little surprising to me. It just struck me that here we are talking about this topic some 20-something years since we remember these debates between Napoleon Chagnon and some of his critics about the extent to which small-scale warfare is a contest over material resources or over access to women, and or whether it's ever a contest over access to women in the absence of the material resource crunch. And Napoleon, of course, was a strong defender of the proposition that it often is. And I mean, Polly, I think, alluded to the mosquito wiener, or was it Patricia?
Both of us.
To this analysis that that external warfare, at least in the former Soviet republics and perhaps more generally, is strongly predicted by the proportion of the population that is young men, and perhaps by sex ratios in that age group, although I'm less sure about that. But has anybody got anything to say about the relevance of sex ratio variation to exacerbating or mitigating all the stuff we've been talking about?
The Chinese might.
Very much so. Yeah, I'm real worried about what's going to happen in China.
There is a paper by Valerie Hudson in International Security, and I think it's called Bare Branches. I can't remember the subtitle, but it's a forecast of China in 2050, I think, when it will have 30 million unmarried men, young men. And I would advise you to, anyone who's interested, look at that paper, because it really starts to get to grips with this issue.
I understand that within the Pentagon, people are talking about how to deal with the coming war with China because of that. So,
to get our women.
I'd like to suggest that to answer Richard's question, what can we do to prevent war? I think it's unlikely that we'll be able to take anything that we learn directly from the psychology lab, the climatology lab, the field, and apply it directly to international relations. Just because any of our theories, by the time they actually matter in how they're applied concretely, will make too many predictions about what we could do and what we couldn't do. And what we need to do is integrate those findings with empirical research closer to the actual facts we're interested in, namely statistically what starts wars, what stops wars, and look for answers there. Just to be concrete, the remarkable decline in war that we've seen in the last 50 years, the decline that we've seen in war in the last 50 years does have a number of statistical antecedents, and the even more striking decline in the last 20 years and the last 10 years. So, for example, in the last 10 years, at least according to the people at Uppsala and Simon Fraser who track these statistics, there has not been a decrease in the number of wars that have started, but there has been an increase in the number of wars that have stopped and that have not reignited. Well, that should cause us to look for what gets people to stop fighting, even if we have no idea what gets them to start. and what gets them to not pick up their arms again. One of their suggestions is that third-party mediation, peacekeeping forces really do work. Not 100% of the time, probably more like a third of the time, but a third of the time is better than none of the time. And that a number of the conflicts, say in Africa, that have been tamped down, leading to the decline in the statistics, are because either the United Nations or coalitions of regional third parties have gotten in between the warring parties, have convinced them to not to get back to war, and have statistically have succeeded. So the empirical data that I think we need, just because of the enormous gap in levels of analysis between human psychology and nations at war, is going to have to be enriched by the best data that we can get on what empirically leads wars to start and stop.
Who's taking it?
I think there's a recent article in PNAS by Scotty Tran and colleagues where they interviewed Arabs and Israelis about what might lead them to reconcile. And they basically found that material incentives actually fueled greater conflict, whereas sort of symbolic gestures from either side were productive in reconciliation.
And also, what we know empirically does seem to predict lower risk of conflict internationally are what are sometimes called the Kantian factors, after Immanuel Kant's essay on perpetual peace. That democracy, as I mentioned in the Q&A session before, does seem to predict lower probability of conflict. Trade does seem to predict lower probability of conflict, and belonging to international organizations, the Economic Union, United Nations, NATO, and so on. Each seems to make an independent statistical contribution to lowered risk. And so it's interesting, I think, to try to explain it at multiple levels, not how does what we know about psychology explain increase or decrease in war, but rather what do we know about psychology that might explain under what conditions people agree to a trading relationship or to be governed by a democracy. And it's a bridge too far, I think, to go from psychology to international relations. We've got to explain each link in the chain separately.
I'd like to pick up Malcolm's point as well. So we heard there about interventions, and a different kind of proposal is the one that really refers to the youth bulge, and would say that one of the most important things you can do politically is to vote for people who will fund family planning in places like Eastern Congo and Rwanda. And Malcolm, do you want to speak more about this?
There's a large unmet need for family planning. If you look at surveys around the world, they're very, very consistent. And the only common factor I can see in very rapid population fertility decline is access to modern contraception backed up by safe abortion. And the decline of fertility in Iran, which has gone from 6 to 2, at some stages even more rapidly than China, with no one-child policy, simply by making contraception available in the cities and in the villages, is, I think, very encouraging. There are now more Iranian women in Tehran University than men, which I think makes for a more civilized society. Osama bin Laden was the 17th child of one man who had 54 children. When Saddam Hussein was born, his mother couldn't even look at him. She was so terrified about this unwanted pregnancy. So I think unwanted pregnancies and very rapid population growth are not something that we need in the world. And if we respect women and give them choices, they will become much less common.
I'd like to just put in one quick remark here. There's a huge conflict between family planning and democracy in places I work in Africa and New Guinea, and that is that people want their tribe to increase in numbers. And if you use family planning, it is not showing loyalty to your tribe because you will not have more votes in the future, and another tribe will get the power. So there's a very big conflict here.
There's always some low-hanging fruit. There's always somebody in the village who has an abortion. If we meet their needs, it's very powerful, I think, how the acceptance of family planning spreads, even in a politically difficult situation.
Since time is going on, and since I was in theory the discussant, I want to just add one third thing, which is one or two people have mentioned about men. And so, men have had something to do with the violence we've been talking about. In October this year, as probably everybody knows, for the first time in the history of the world, a important legislative body became numerically dominated by women, which was the Parliament of Rwanda. And I would just like to sort of hang that out there as a way to get people thinking about political change that could be significant. Do we think that having women be numerically dominant in political legislatures would be important? And Cheryl, you've been...
Well, to follow up on that, there's a group of women in Liberia that could be credited for ending the civil war that was lasting there for 14 years, and now they have a female president. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that simplistic idea of, if women were in power more, there would be less war, there would be less violence.
Yeah, I would like to make two comments about the difference between men and women. The first has to do with the idea that when there was a threat to the community, the women would put a white feather on a man's lapel saying, "You're a coward, you wouldn't go." The idea being somehow, women are just as aggressive as men, therefore in favor of war. And actually there's some truth there, because women are fierce defenders of their communities. And if you can convince the women that the only way to keep this community secure and defend it is to go to war, hey, they'll vote for it to war. They'll go over and have you kill anybody anywhere. So it's not that women are innately more nicer or necessarily less violent, but war is it creates social upheaval. And that's what women don't like. They are really adapted for social stability. So in order to keep social stability, if what's required is war, well, they'll do war. But their main priority is social stability. So we shouldn't misunderstand the difference between women, what it is that they're after. The second thing I would like to say is I am somewhat of an activist. So I spend a lot of time at peace institutes, talking to people who are professional peace negotiators, people who work at the United Nations and so on. And it's becoming very clear to them, whether we've gotten it in science yet or not, it's very clear to them when you get women involved in the negotiations, in the peace process, or get them involved before the war breaks out, you're much more likely to have a better, more peaceful, more negotiated win-win outcome. And in fact, I love this comment. I'll close with this comment that I heard recently. This woman works at the United Nations, and they were having a conference between these two opposing sides, and she said to them, look, you don't have any women at the negotiating table. You need to get some women at the negotiating table. And they said, we're not going to do that because the women will compromise.
So, before Steve Downs makes some concluding remarks, I'd like to extrapolate and make a more radical solution along those lines for a long-term solution, and that is to colonize Mars and send all the men back there.
This is working. I just wanted to thank all of today's presenters for coming. Thank all of you for coming along. And Kristen Hawkes had this idea that I sum up the entire discussion for today, and I'm not going to do that. But I'll tell you one of the reasons why. In my field, which is philosophy, we put lots of things on the table and then seem to just leave it at that. So far, we're in that mode, but I think that's a good place to be. But one thing I did want to tell you about is some of you may not be scientists and may not go to scientific conferences, and so you might be wondering what this poster session is. We have about 20 participants at this conference whose work will be displayed tonight, and the way that it's displayed is in posters, and they'll all be there to present on it. And it's kind of informal, should be fun, and you'll also be able to get together with people, the rest of the participants today, and talk about stuff we've been talking about so far. So that will be at the Alta Club, which is in downtown Salt Lake City, at 8 o'clock this evening. And I look forward to seeing you there. And then we start proceedings tomorrow at... Sorry? I never get it right. You tell me. 100 East South Temple. Thank you very much. There you have it. It's a big old building down there. Yeah, we'll have to give you a map.
And tomorrow we're starting up at 8:55 apparently, so that David Carrier can sum up proceedings and get us on our way. So I want you to thank all of our presenters today and hopefully see you at the Alta Club tonight. Thanks very much.